Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Shamila and Sophia and the American Pakistan Foundation for having us. I'm delighted to be here representing SADA and the South Asian American Digital Archive, and also to talk a little bit about my own background as an oral historian. I have lived and worked in Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, and collected oral histories there. My own heritage can be traced back to Aligarh. My father was born in Aligarh in 1842 and migrated to Pakistan in late 47. So I've grown up in and out of Pakistan my entire life and have very close connections with family in Lahore, especially, but also Karachi and Islamabad. And it is a real thrill for me to get to be here speaking to the American Pakistan Foundation, which is my father would be extremely proud were he here to see it. So I wanted to start off by just introducing you to SADA as an organization in case folks aren't as familiar with it. I know that some among you may be supporters of SADA, but I want to do just a brief introduction. And then I'll turn it over to Ayshea to share a little bit about her story as well. So to start off, just a little bit of background on SADA, the South Asian American Digital Archive, is about 13 years old, and our work represents 5.4 million South Asians living in the United States. We don't focus on a single country or people of a single national origin, but prefer to sort of take the more expansive view of thinking about South Asian people and migrants from South Asia as a group, which includes 1 in 100 Americans who trace their heritage to South Asia, which when my partner heard that, he said, "Oh, I thought you were 1 in a million. Turns out you're only 1 in 100. But these communities in the US that whose stories we are committed to documenting and preserving in the archive trace their heritage to Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, the Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and of course the many South Asian diaspora communities around the world, including folks who have come to the United States as secondary migration from Africa or other places in Asia. Of course, those migrations have not been easy. South Asians have been coming to the United States and to the Americas more generally in some way, shape, or form, probably since the 1830s, but in much larger waves starting in the late 19th century. By the time that South Asians came in larger numbers at the beginning of the 20th century, they entered an America that had actively begun to exclude Asian migrants. So beginning in 1882 with the Chinese Exclusion Act, 1907 legislation to exclude the Japanese and later Filipinos. So South Asians came into the spaces left behind when those Asian immigrants had been deported or when their immigration had been stopped. And in the 1920s, very famously, South Asians began to seek the rights and privileges of American citizenship. So in the Supreme Court case of 1923, United States v. Bhagat Singh Thind, a Punjabi Sikh of high caste Brahmin heritage made a case that he should be eligible for US citizenship as a free white person who could trace his heritage to Aryan, Caucasian communities. And the Supreme Court disagreed. So at this point in 1923, South Asians become racialized as non-American others. It impacted the ability of South Asians to secure citizenship until the 1940s, and in fact extended to wives of South Asian men who had migrated to this country, whether their wives were of South Asian heritage or white American heritage. They actually were denaturalized in 1923. By 1924, almost all Asian migration was banned, starting in 1917 with the Asia barred zone that stopped immigration for all practical purposes from most of Asia, from India all the way over to Japan. And was not really until 1965, as I'm sure you know, that South Asians began to come to the United States in larger numbers because of a change as part of a body of civil rights legislation in 1965 that abolished the earlier restrictions, the quotas, and the exclusions that had pertained to Asian migrants coming to the US. In 1965, the US opened up its borders, particularly to people with higher education and scientific qualifications, but also opened the door to family reunification. And those two provisions that exist in the 1965 Act have really shaped the South Asian American community. They've really shaped the United States more broadly. Although, if you hear the way President Lyndon B. Johnson announced the act when he signed it in 1965, he claimed that it was not going to have a big impact, that it shouldn't dramatically affect American demographics or American life. And of course, he was dead wrong on that, in the ways that the 1965 Act has really shaped the diversity of American society. And as the census of 2020 really shows, has led to not only a more diverse American society, but a more interconnected and intermixed American society. And that is something that I think is a transformational change that we'll see over the next many decades. More people like me who identify as coming from a mixed heritage. My father was Pakistani, my mother is white American. And Sada's work really is designed to preserve the stories of those migrant communities and in the vast variety of stories that exist within our communities. We shouldn't imagine our community stories to be limited to a single strain, a single time period, but in fact, going back into the 19th century, we see much history of mixing between South Asians and Puerto Rican communities, between South Asians and Mexican American communities, and now increasingly just across the board. But unless we preserve those stories both of solidarity and of attempts to secure the privileges of citizenship through every means necessary, we risk losing that history and that heritage. And it is against erasure that Sada does its work, being driven by this concept that a community without its records is a community under siege, defending itself, its identity, and its version of history without a firm foundation on which to stand. We believe that our history has value and is a firm foundation. And so Sada responded, our founder, Samit, sorry, the lights in my office go off if I don't move. Our co-founders, Samit Malik and Michelle Caswell, looked around and saw that there was not an archive that was dedicated to the histories and stories of South Asian Americans, and they set out to create one. That was 13 years ago. We are still here, in part because of the ways that the organization has really creatively engaged the archive, and because we don't hold anyone's records. The records of Sada remain in the community. They remain in homes or organizations that are able to preserve them, but we make them widely available. In doing that, we have what's called a post-custodial and digital only model that allows us to make images of artifacts available for people and creates a lot of capacity for community engagement. This is something that we believe very deeply in, is that the archive is enriched by engagement with the materials in it. And so we are all constantly soliciting the engagement of the community, inviting them to contribute materials to the archive, and also to find ways of interacting with the materials that are already there. If you visit Sada's website, this is what you'll see, a sort of accounting of a variety of projects that we have worked on over the last decade or so, from engaging artists to work with artifacts and create art based on materials in the archive, to Tides, which is an online magazine that features short articles that engage with particular artifacts or materials or histories that are preserved in the archive. In the last few years, we've done a number of collecting projects. This is one of my favorites, the road trip projects. That always reminds me of driving to Yosemite, sitting in the back seat of my parents' rental car, or driving through California. My mother's family actually came from Marysville, California, which has a large Sikh American population and has had since the late 19th century. And I can remember driving through that Northern California farmland and seeing Sikh farmers there as a child. The Road Trip Project collects those stories and maps the presence of South Asian Americans throughout the continental United States, showing where we have been and where we continue to go. During the pandemic, we were highly aware of the fact that South Asian Americans were operating both on the front lines of medical pandemic response and also on the front lines of service work that was keeping communities sustained, and of course everywhere in between. So we created a collection initiative to invite people to tell their stories. We continue to accept stories into these collections and encourage you to share your story, what we call letters from 6 feet away. This, what you remember, and what you experienced of the 2020 pandemic lockdown, but also how it continues to affect your family and your livelihood. The archive is currently based in Philadelphia, in the sense that Samit Malik, our executive director, and myself, the outgoing president of the board of directors, are both based here in Philly. And one of the things that Philly is best known for is its US history, its American history. And we felt that SADA could make an intervention into that history by encouraging people to expand their concept of who belongs in a story of American history. And so we created a walking tour that tours the historic sites of Philadelphia, from Independence Hall to the Liberty Bell to the wharfs and the ports on the Delaware River, to craft a narrative about the engagement of South Asian American immigrants in demands for freedom and concepts of what it means to be an American, and also more broadly implicated in stories about American becoming. And a project that I'm particularly proud of is one that has developed in the last couple of years, which is our Archival Creators Fellowship Program. This program is designed specifically to bring new contributors into the archive with specific collecting agendas, where we invite archival creators to bring materials to the archive from their own communities, and particularly from communities that are marginalized within the broader world of South Asian America. And so these archival creators, we've had 2 classes of archival creators, and we are just initiating our 3rd round, have brought stories of queer Muslims. They have brought stories of Kachis. They've brought stories of Bangladeshi entrepreneurs. They've brought stories of South Asians in incarceration. They've brought stories of South Asians in the AIDS epidemic, Indo-Caribbean people who have migrated throughout South and North America. And I think that they have done the most meaningful work for expanding the archive and how it engages with our communities. The very last thing I'll say before turning it over to Ayshea is to announce to you something that we've been working on for many years, and I keep my book close at hand, which is the Our Stories book that we've published in 2021. It is the outcome of many, many years of work by dozens and dozens of scholars. It is a thick volume, and it collects in hard copy stories of our community in all of the range of their diversity, from the earliest days of South Asian migration to the US until now. And we want to thank the American Pakistan Foundation for supporting the book, for purchasing copies to deposit in libraries, and also for being a supporter of the Our Stories Book Club, which meets once a month, and each month we'll take up a chapter of the book to discuss. And the first event was this past weekend, and stay tuned join our mailing list and stay tuned for events that are coming up. And also, we'd love it if you'd follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, so that you can keep up with the news about SADA. And again, thank you so much to APF for having us.
Thank you, Amber, for that wonderful introduction to SADA and its work. And thank you to the American Pakistan Foundation for having me and organizing this event. As mentioned, my name is Ayshea Khan. I'm the proud SADA board member and also an Asian Pacific American community archivist with the Austin History Center, which is the historic division of the Austin Public Library. I just want to echo Amber's excitement around Our Stories, because that publication was one of my very first introductions to SADA's archive. I was in graduate school at the time studying archival preservation in Austin, and I was feeling really stuck and uninspired. While I enjoyed the theory and the archival practices that I was learning, I was often frustrated because the collections and readings we encountered often didn't resemble identities that I held. And I think I remember out of exasperation, just Googling South Asian American archives and not really expecting to find anything. But what I did find was a Kickstarter for to fund a publication, an educational textbook solely dedicated to the vibrant and diverse histories and experiences of South Asian Americans. And that's what led me to explore the vast array of different stories that you can find in SADA's archive. Through finding and exploring SADA, I felt like I had truly come home. It really led me to explore what community archiving looked like, what this post-custodial model really meant. And I really resonated with the work of Michelle Caswell, who was a co-founder of SADA. And she uses this term symbolic annihilation in relation to South Asian Americans and their experience when looking through our traditional archival repositories. And she says to be symbolically annihilated is to feel like an internal outsider whose very existence is presumed an impossibility. In the wake of this absence, marginalized communities fail to see themselves or their places in the world. Being a longtime volunteer and collaborator with SADA since 2015 has really helped me feel more rooted in my identity and has also empowered me to take up more space as a Pakistani South Asian American and an archivist. Because of the mentorship I've received from Sameep and getting heavily involved with SADA's archival work, I've been able to take some of those models and practices into my position at the History Center and to diversify our local historical narratives at the Austin History Center. And so these are just some examples of some of the South Asian archives we've been able to uncover here in Austin. As Ambar mentioned in her introduction, SADA is truly an archive and organization built and for our South Asian American communities. And there are so many different fantastic digital projects and initiatives and entry points for all of us to get involved. One of the very first initiatives I got to be a part of when I was a graduate student was the First Days Project, which is an online platform that collects micro oral histories of immigrants' first days in the United States. And that collects stories from folks all over the world immigrating to America. And I had the opportunity to record several oral histories and have them be a part of the archive. And it was such a transformative act for me to just be able to contribute to an archive as a graduate student. And so just to conclude my introduction, I just wanted to share a highlight, one short clip from a First Day story from Pakistani-American Ali Khattab, who currently resides in Austin and immigrated to the United States in 1980.
Transfer to University of Texas. But my first day arriving was, where are all the daisies? Because you just don't feel like you fit in. You're looking for your own kind of people. And you find, first thing you do is you find out, I tried to find out where I'm going to stay. And because I had not reserved a dorm, and but I had made some plans of staying in an apartment and with sharing with somebody. So I did not know who my roommate was and all that. So, but the first day when I arrived, it was, I don't know what to say, but it was very, lonely. You don't have the people that you have been growing up with, your friends, your parents, your sister, brother, and then you come over, and then suddenly it's a different environment, and you don't have a single friend. I mean, zero, zilch. You're starting with a blank slate, and I create friends very easily and all that. But that was the loneliness was the number one. I mean, if you want me to put it all in one word, initially the first day was loneliness, because you don't have anybody to count on. You don't have you don't know whom to ask for advice, and you don't know if they're going to give you the right advice. It was very interesting. It was different. It was, I think, helpless and loneliness were the two words that I would put the experience into. The first day. Now, ask me, after a month, oh my God, I was a party animal.
When listening to Ali's story, I see so many connections to my father's own immigration story when he immigrated to Massachusetts in the late 1980s. And so I really believe that having increased access to stories and histories like this can really help us feel less alone in the world. And so I'm really excited to have so many of you on this call today because I believe each of you has a unique perspective and family history that can really deepen our understanding of the Pakistani-American experience. But sometimes before even, donating a story to an archive like SADA, there's a lot of steps that we have to take first. And those can sometimes be overwhelming, challenging, and it can be difficult to know where to start. So Ambar and I are going to share some practices and guidelines that we've learned along the way in both our professional and personal experiences with family archives. I'll begin with a short discussion on how to set some goals and maybe come up with a plan for developing a family archiving project. Then Ambar will go over some best practices and strategies for interviewing your family or loved ones. And then I'll follow up with an archival preservation 101 for those of you who may have physical archives in your care. As mentioned at the beginning, we'll definitely have plenty of time at the end to answer any questions that you may have about SADA or your own family collections. So I always like to start workshops with these with a question, and just so I can get to know a little bit about who's on the call with us today. But if I was to ask what is in your family archive, what first comes to mind? The word archive is used in a lot of different contexts. This word archive is interpreted. So if you just want to take a minute to think about what might be in your family archive, I'd love to see your answers, and you can drop them in the chat. Immigration documents and pictures, absolutely. That's a great example. Lots of photos, yes, family vacations is such a big memory, site for memory. Oh, I'm so happy to see home movies. That's something that my dad would do all the time with me and my brother as we were kids. Recipes is a great example. Yes, more recipes. This is great. Archives really take all different shapes and forms depending on your community and your family. For me, I have a lot of photographs and a lot of home movies. These are mostly photographs from my father's side of the family. As I mentioned, he immigrated to Massachusetts, the Boston area in the late 1980s when he was only 19 years old. And he brought very little with him. He was young. He probably wasn't thinking about different kinds of archives and what he wanted to bring with him. He brought very little. And to this day, he's still the only member of his family that live in the United States. And so growing up, he was doing a lot of recording of my brother and I, with the home movies and taking a lot of photos, because I think he was attempting to create a family archive for us, something that he was kind of severed from because of his immigration to the US. And even though I don't think that I will ever donate these photos to an archive, maybe I will, tracking down visual traces of my family's history has been really personally healing for me, because it gives me an opportunity to see different sides of my father that I've never seen before, or sometimes can get buried in his sometimes serious demeanor. So these photos of him dancing and wearing bold printed clothing, and even these photos of him smiling when he's young, is really transformational for me, and something that I love to share with not only my family, like my brother and other members of our extended family, but I'm really excited to hopefully share it with future generations of our family, so that they can learn their family's story, but also feel a sense of solidarity and community with other South Asian Americans around them. So your archive and the reasons for preserving them will always be unique to you, but it's so important that we embark on this process, but it can sometimes be confusing where to start. So before you jump into digitizing photographs or interviewing your family members, I always find that it's kind of helpful to take some time to think through your personal and maybe community or family goals around what you want to save and prioritize. It's impossible to save everything. Even at the History Center, we don't keep everything. We discard material all the time. So sitting down and thinking through some basic questions can really help you prioritize what to work on first. I'm going to go through some questions to think about. I can certainly share this presentation after we're done today, but think through some of these questions and maybe even write some of those answers down. You can hang them up in your workspace where you might be working on your family archiving project. They're good reminders and can really help you when you're feeling overwhelmed. So the first thing that I'll always say is start when you feel ready. Sometimes you inherit a family collection, maybe when a family member passes away. Sometimes you're moving and you just take everything with you from one house to the next. And there might be a sense of urgency to get things done as quickly as possible. That often can result in being overwhelmed, and you either throw everything away all at once or you tuck it away and never touch it again. Family archiving can be a real emotional process. A lot of different feelings can come up unexpectedly. So I always encourage you to start when you feel ready and when you have some resources and a plan in place. Something that can help you develop where to start is thinking about what story do you want to pass on? And maybe what objects or family members or other material is going to help you tell that story. Is it going to be the 50 photographs of that beautiful meal that you prepared? Or, maybe you just went for a walk and took some photographs. Is that what's going to help you tell your story? Probably not. So try to think about maybe major events in your family's history that you already know of or have heard of, or maybe some big shifts in your family's history that you want to explore. And then just writing those sort of transition moments or key moments down can help you kind of focus your work. In terms of what kind of material to start with first, I always try to encourage folks to think about what material or stories might be at risk of being lost or forgotten. So that could be, really fragile or old physical material like photographs, correspondence, other kinds of paper documentation. That might be something that you prioritize for digitization or really ensuring that it's housed in a safe way. Alternatively, if you're focusing on oral histories, you might want to start with some elders in your family that have a lot of rich memories that you want to make sure that you record before they're not accessible anymore. I also really encourage folks to start with things that they have, especially with stories and histories of immigration. There's a lot of unknowns and a lot of things that we don't have. So for example, it's been really hard for me to track down photographs of my grandfather. But instead of focusing and getting trapped in that rabbit hole, I've been trying to take time with photographs that I do have. And sometimes really working on something with information that you already know is there can help. Not only, you're preserving something, you're making steps towards your goal that's achievable and attainable, but it also can open up pathways of new information and gives you something that you can share with your family. So, once you've digitized that one family album that's already in your home, you can share that with other family members, and that might encourage them to open up, share whatever family album they have in their home, or it might, unlock some other memories and make people feel more encouraged to share with you. Lastly, I always recommend trying to build a community of support around your family archiving project. You may be the only one in your family that's going to take on the role as a family archivist. And sometimes that can be taxing and overwhelming. And even if you're the one that's doing the physical sort of digitizing or cataloging or recording oral histories, try to identify other people that can be on your side, even if it's someone that you can check in with along the way to kind of report out how you've been working on your project and share, because it really helps to have someone that can take time and celebrate with you along the way. The goal here is not to, go in and think that you're going to manage your collection perfectly right off the bat, but it's much more sustainable and attainable if you strive for small refinements over time and just making a consistent effort to tend to your family history. Maybe it's only recording 1 or 2 oral histories around the holiday every year, or maybe, 2 or 3 times a year, you look at your family photographs and, prioritize one subset to digitize or try to describe. You'll be surprised at how quickly you make progress. And just again, to make sure that you can share that with your family along the way. So once you've come up with your plan, it's time to dig into the nitty-gritty. So I'm going to pass it back over to Ambar, who can share a little bit more about oral history and interviewing strategies for family archives.
I was saying thank you. I always learn so much from your presentations. Okay, let me see if I can get this one up. Sorry. You'd think I'd be better at this after doing it for 2 years. But... All right. When we think about archiving our family's histories, I'm noticing in your responses so many physical objects. But those physical objects are also tied to our memories of them. And one way to collect our memories of them is to collect oral histories. For me, this quotation from Alessandro Portelli, who's sort of one of the grand theorists of oral history, has been kind of a guiding light, that oral history tells us less about events than it tells us about their meaning. And when I read your list of clothes, clothing, jewelry, recipes, the reason that those artifacts are important to you is because of the stories that they help you to understand about the meaning of your family and your family's history. I can say from personal experience that I started a research project on partition in 2005, interviewing some elders of my family and our community. And in the course of that, I was able to interview my grandmother only for about 5 minutes. But I have her voice now. And that's such an extraordinary gift to me. She passed away just a few years later, and I can always go back and listen to her. Even though she was afraid of the microphone, she was very uncomfortable, she didn't really want to talk. So when we think about meaning, there's the meaning in the story, but there's also the meaning in the experience of gathering together with your family and creating space for them to share their stories. And that's something that is important about oral history, is that oral history, as opposed to other kinds of like informational interviewing, is really about human connection. It's really about creating space and giving time for someone to tell their story and for the interviewer to hear it. And so anytime I think you're thinking about conducting oral histories with members of your own family, I love the way Ayshea contextualizes the preparatory work to say you have to prepare yourself for the experience of doing the work. And with oral history, because you're sitting down with somebody that you love and care about, I think that preparatory work is especially important. You may think that you know what they're going to say, but believe me, they're going to tell you something new every time you sit down and ask someone to share their story. So oral history has a set of principles and best practices. I'm going to engage with those a couple of times because it's important to protect the rights of storytellers as content creators. The story ultimately belongs to the person who is telling it. And we are, as interviewers, the recipients of that story. So we should always make sure that they're telling the story in a space that feels comfortable and safe for them. Logistical things. Anytime you are getting ready to do an interview, it's important to make sure your equipment works. Make sure you have a decent recorder. I'm a big fan of a small handheld recorder. When I first started interviewing, I actually used a microphone adapter on my phone. These days, the phones have pretty decent recording technology, but you're able to record a higher quality using a small handheld recorder. And don't make the mistake I made last year and forget to make sure you have fresh batteries in your recorder before you go. But I also recommend taking a notebook. I think we're all quite used to taking notes on our computers or maybe an iPad or a phone, but actually being able to take notes with pen and paper in an interview is less intrusive usually, and it allows you to jot down your thoughts as you go without interrupting the flow of conversation so that you can circle back later. I also always recommend taking a camera and photographing the space and photographing the narrator if you have their permission. Sometimes getting a sense of the space you're sitting in can help to create that context in which the interview is taking place. I use this presentation to train students. It's incredibly important to ensure that you have consent from the person that you're speaking to. This is especially important if you intend to deposit the oral history interview in a larger archive or collection, for instance, with SADA, in which case we wouldn't be able to take it unless we had a release form from a narrator. If the intention is to keep those stories within your family, maybe that's what your agreement with your narrators says. So I won't go too much into sort of the rights and the documentation, because I know we're talking about working with family members, but if someone has questions about that or is curious, I'd be happy to share with you the oral history release form that I use and that can be quite useful for making sure you have the appropriate forms of consent. But it is important to mention in any context that you may not use someone's story in a way that would not be appropriate or consented by them, because again, the storyteller owns the story before anyone else. Let's see. So this is my oral history release form. Again, I'm not going to dwell on that, but I'm happy to share it. When you are interviewing somebody that you know already, of course, you may not need to go into the introduction, but I do think it's still useful whenever you sit down with someone whose story you'd like to collect to talk to them about your purpose. As Ayshea said, to know what kind of a story you're trying to preserve and what your goal is in collecting it. But also to give them some parameters for the space. I expect we'll be here for about an hour or an hour and a half. I find personally an hour and a half is about the right amount of time, particularly when I'm interviewing elders. It's hard to sit for much longer than that. But I find that things really settle in and get comfortable 45 minutes or so in. So if you're doing an hour-long interview, it may not be quite enough time to get to the meat of the story that you'd like to collect. Remind them, of course, that you'd be making an audio recording, that you'd like to take their photograph and include it with the interview. So these are the things that I think are really key to having a positive experience for both the interviewee, the person who's speaking, and the interviewer. And that is to know your topic, to have done some research before you go. Maybe you have a variety of snippets of a story that have been told in your family, and you'd like to get someone to hear from someone who is there. But make sure that you know how the pieces fit together as best you can, so that when you come, you can ask informed questions of your storyteller. But then, even more crucially, to listen to the story they tell. Having too many expectations for the story can sometimes create deep disappointment. But there is tremendous opportunity in being a good listener and being a deep listener when someone is telling a story that is important to them. So I recommend, asking follow-up questions that demonstrates that you're listening, that you're paying attention, to remain engaged, if you're able to interview in physical proximity with someone that it's safe for you to be around, sit close to them, maintain eye contact. Sometimes the language of the body tells you as much as the language of the voice. And so being able to sit close together, to be able to be in a space together is incredibly meaningful. I've been doing interviews over the last year on Zoom. It is possible. And I think there was a lot of urgency to continue interviewing, particularly interviewing elders during the last 2 years when we've had to maintain social distance. I'm deeply eager to get back to face-to-face interviewing as often as possible, because I think that that presence, that sharing space together, goes a long way to creating connection. And then the third piece sort of would be to think about the interview space. If I'm not mistaken, Ayshea, one of my former students from the University of Texas, had actually conducted that interview with Ali Fatah. And I was texting her about it today, and she said, "I'm so sorry that my audio recorder, the quality was so bad." She said, "I was just a poor undergraduate." And that's all true, but she did something really smart, which was she reserved a quiet room in which to conduct the interview in the library at UT. And that makes a big difference, because the audio quality on that interview isn't perfect, but at least it doesn't have a lot of background noise. So as you're planning this experience, I would say, get as quiet a space as you can. When I interviewed my grandmother, it was in the middle of the living room, the fan was going, the swamp cooler was on, it's so noisy. If you're desperate, get whatever audio that you can. But if you're able, find a quiet space. It makes a big difference. And so here are a couple of tips for actually structuring an interview. This, I think, is incredibly important to getting a story in its fullness. I think sometimes we have some urgency about, like, I want to collect a story about X event. But as I said at the beginning, oral history is really about meaning. It's less than we think about events. And so placing a story in the context of somebody's full life helps us to understand why it matters so much to them to tell the particular story that they do. And so I always start with the lead, the project purpose, making sure that I read that into the record to let any future listener know who I am as an interviewer, who I am interviewing, and why, but also when and where. I always read in my name, the date, the location, the purpose of the interview, and the name of the person I'm interviewing. And I always start my interviews with the same question: please tell me when and where you were born. And this helps to create context, particularly when we're interviewing somebody with a migration story. It gives us an entrance into thinking about the context that shaped their early life, and possibly even the ambitions that they had to migrate, or the circumstances under which that migration story unfolded. So I always start with early life. And once I've got a little bit of context about that, and I'll share some questions at the end that help you to build out that context. I try to get into what is the event or the meaning, the purposeful sort of centerpiece of the interview that I'm looking for. And this is where we start getting into what we might call the depth questions. I sometimes start off this purposeful turn by using the questions from the First Days project. I think that that's a really nice way to get people to talk about their migration story, if that's what you're interested in. Tell me about your first day in the United States, or tell me about your migration. What was it like when you arrived here? Who met you at the airport? And from there, getting into some of the more in-depth questions about people's experience, the transformations that they experienced, their challenges, their victories, the things that led to the most important and meaningful growth in their own lives, and becoming who you know them to be and who you love so much to spend this time with them. After we've been in that space for a while, we've co-created this story. And I think that's something that's important to remember, is that we think of oral histories as a co-created document, which is to say the storyteller owns the story, but it wouldn't exist in this context without you, the interviewer, participating in it. And you are as much participant in that story ultimately as they are. So you can guide the narrator to what we might call the reflective turn towards implications or meaning. How have these experiences changed you? What would you like to leave for future generations? And what are your final thoughts? I often end an interview by asking if there's anything else that they would like to tell me. So as things begin to wind down, I will often say, is there anything that you would like to return to or you haven't mentioned? And what do you think is the most important thing that I should understand about your story? And sometimes that allows people to share a tidbit of wisdom. Often I find with elders, they will give me the thing that they think is most important to teach to a younger member of the family or their community, that is both personal and pertains to a larger collective experience. So that's kind of the interview structure that I suggest that people use. It brings together in a relatively short amount of time a fair amount of life history, and it's a great starting point. You may not need to use this structure for every interview if you are doing a longer series, but for a first interview, I think this is a pretty good foundation. As I said, I gave you a little bit of this. Make sure that you tag the recording with who's there, where you are, why you're there, and with these sort of early life questions about their childhood. I think as Ayshea was mentioning, it's important to know what you're looking for, what you want. Certainly you are looking for people's stories, but you're looking for those stories within a particular context. And it's good to know what is it about that context that's so important for you. So here are some of the questions from the First Days project. Ayshea would know more, having done some interviews for that. I just contributed interviews, excerpts that I had done with other people. My father passed away just as we were beginning the First Days project, and I was able to excerpt an interview I had done with him and put it there. But also at his memorial service, we had a huge First Days project poster with the text of his interview. And it was wonderful for people who had known him for a long time to get this glimpse of another aspect of his identity and his experience around a lot of people who loved him and cared about him. So when we get to those depth questions, it's important to keep in mind that you really might bump into things that you didn't expect to find. I have so often walked out of an interview surprised because I got a totally different story than the one I was expecting. And once I adjust my expectations, I often find that those stories provide the most transformative adjustments in my thinking and my understanding of someone's experience. But it is important to know that some of these stories may be things that people had hidden or tried to hide for a long time. And it's okay to ask about family histories and even about things that they have not shared widely. People may be ready to tell a story that at one time didn't seem possible for them to share. With the passing of time, they might be ready to let it out. If they're not, don't push, but if they are, be a deep listener and honor that story in all of its sensitivity, so that you can, with the storyteller, really embrace its meaning in terms of how their own life has unfolded. So things I would say about histories, and I may go through some of this a little bit quickly. I think people and groups have histories. And so when we're asking our family members, we may presume to know something about our family's history, but my guess is that there's a whole lot there that we don't know yet. And so be careful about your presuppositions, be careful about what you think you know, because it shouldn't stop you from being able to hear what you don't know yet. I think I would just briefly address trauma, and then I'm gonna pass things back to Ayshea here in just a moment. But to remember that migration is an experience of dislocation for many people, even if it's something that they wanted and they sought. And that disruption can create mixed feelings and mixed emotions because of the inversion of relationships and expectations. And so it's important to approach someone's story with openness to what their experience means to them, not to expect that a migration is always a triumph. It is quite often accompanied by loss or trauma. I think about my own family's stories from partition, and while they had worked for Pakistan and anticipated its creation, for some members of my family, they were active in election work and fighting on behalf of Pakistan, but it also meant a tremendous amount of loss for family histories and property and experiences and connections left behind in India. Even when my father came to the United States, eager as he was to embrace his life here, it meant leaving behind young siblings and the relationships that he may have been able to develop with them. And so when we think about trauma, we should remember that it's not only in the context of war, or catastrophic events. It also comes in this kind of inversion of life experience and the challenges of coming to a place where, as we well know, South Asians have not always been welcomed with open arms, and that many people in our communities have experienced humiliation, deliberate or accidental. I can think about the number of times that we were stopped for special searches in the airport, and how painful those often were for us. Loss of family, fear of rejection, fear of separation from the things that made life meaningful back at home. And I'll close with secrets. I think I've already mentioned this a little bit, but we all have some secrets that we carry with us, and it may be time to let them out. Your narrator may be willing to do that. And then the last thing I would say is to think about how to deal with it if somebody is cautious about speaking. And so the first thing I say is ask good questions. This PowerPoint was designed for my students, so there's some things here that are not totally relevant, but to ask good questions really depends on how well you are listening. So to follow up on specifics from someone's storytelling. And here's an example I made up once. If someone says, I love baseball because I always used to go to games with my dad and he died when I was 7, what's a good follow-up question to that? How can you engage with this story? I had an experience like this very recently where I was talking to someone about language, and they were talking about how important it was to speak Urdu in their home when they were a child. And they said, yeah, I mean, and when I was 10, yeah, it was important to speak Urdu. And I said, what happened when you were 10? Because they started to go there and then pulled back. what happened when they were 10 was the death of a parent. And it was clear that that shifted the dynamics in their household. So good listening can sometimes open up a whole new set of possibilities. At the end of your interview, say thank you. It's part of being a good steward of a story. And I always encourage people to write a handwritten thank you note, even if it's to someone in your family. Who doesn't love a handwritten thank you note? And then it can go in your family's archive, and it will be there for generations to come as evidence of the care that you put into this experience. So back to material archives, Ayshea, I'll turn it over to you. And I welcome any questions that you have about oral history interviewing in the Q&A. I'll be happy to answer at the end.
Thank you, Amber, for sharing so much of your expertise. I also always learn so much from you, and we're so lucky to have so many of your students working around the country collecting stories. We even have oral histories at the Austin History Center conducted by your students. So we're really lucky to have you and all of your knowledge. And so I often find that oral history can be a great place to start with family archiving projects. And then when conducting an interview with your family member, there may be physical archives that are nearby that also need attention and care. And so I'm going to take the next 5 to 10 minutes to just go over some basic preservation tips for any physical material that might be a part of your family archive. And as I go through some of these recommendations, it's common to feel maybe insecure or kind of, overwhelmed. Maybe you're not keeping things the way I'm outlining in my presentation, but kind of as similar as Amber was mentioning about the quality of the recording. Even if your archives aren't in perfect condition or housed in the right type of environment, the fact that you're thinking about your family's history and you know where some archives are, it's a great first step. And, these are refinements that you're going to make over time. So please don't feel overwhelmed if you're doing any of the things that I recommend not to do with your family archive. I always like to lead with that. Probably, if anything else, I would always try to start with the right kind of environment where your family archives should be held. A lot of times, archives are found in sort of 3 common spaces: our attics, our garages, or our basements. And unfortunately, these are really poor temperature conditions for our archives. You really want to strive to keep physical material in a temperature controlled environment, ideally with low humidity, and some protection from light, and keeping it off the ground should any sort of natural disaster or, flooding or just, a spill should occur, your material is protected. So instead of our basements or attics or garages, I tend to recommend people, sometimes there's that shelf in the closet. That is a really great place because the door of the closet protects it from light. And then it's elevated off the ground, and it's often a cooler part of your home. So even if you have a naturally warmer environment, sometimes the closet can be a little cooler. Shelves or tops of dresser drawers are also great options as well. And you'll see in this, in sort of this photograph of what to do or where to keep material, you'll see these like sort of bluish gray archival boxes. So those are archival grade storage boxes that are designed for paper documents, photographs. Even if you're not able to get an archival grade box like this, I always recommend trying to find a container that is roughly the same size as the material that you're trying to preserve. So anything too big or too small will either, crumple or force the material to bend, which can cause damage over time, or if it's too big, it often doesn't have the right kind of support. So trying to find something that is at least the same size of your objects that you're preserving is what I recommend. I have a lot of photographs that are kept in shoe boxes. Those are archivally recommended, but it is the right size and has an enclosure that protects the material from light. So that's a great sort of option in the meantime. When talking about specific material, like physical documents, so I heard that some people had immigration documentation, maybe you have certificates, family correspondence or letters, maybe business records if your family owned a small business, all kinds of paper documents. Those are great to store sort of in a folder, in a document box. You'll see that if you have any rolled material or maybe letters that were folded up in an envelope, I always recommend trying to delicately unroll and flatten those items or unfold them, remove them from the enclosure, because again, that folding and rolling will cause strain on your documents over time. So laying them flat and supported either in a folder, or you'll see these archival plastic sleeves, is a really great way to kind of prolong the life of your paper documents. If a paper document is particularly brittle, so you'll see that this document has some torn edges, it looks really fragile. Instead of using an adhesive like tape or rubber cement or glue or staples, try to avoid those. You can always put, a thicker piece of cardstock or archival board underneath that document and put it in a sleeve, and that's going to really protect it. Oftentimes, I'm not even equipped to do in-depth like conservation work on documents. So sometimes just enclosing it in the right enclosure and keeping it out of light is a really good strategy to keep it for the long-term preservation. And then just a note about newspapers. I love the look of old newspapers. It's always great if you had like a loved one that was featured in an article, or maybe your family's business ran ads in a local publication. Newspapers are a wealth of family history, but they really weren't designed to last. They were being printed daily. And so they deteriorate over time and often can stain the materials that is housed in the same enclosure. So sometimes they'll yellow paper and that kind of thing. So I always recommend that if you have newsprint in your collection, to make a scan or at least a photocopy as a backup, should like the newspaper sort of start to fall apart over time. And then if you want to hold on to the original, just kind of enclosing it in its own plastic bag or own separate folder, kind of away from your photographs or other paper documents. Photographs, I get a lot of questions about photographs. Y'all mentioned that you had, a lot of photographs in your family collections. And I think the main enemy for photographs in terms of preservation is light. So trying to keep your photographic collections in cool, dark places, again, is going to be your ally here. If you have particularly old, fragile family photographs that are beautiful and you want to keep on display, that would be another candidate for digitization. I would recommend, making a copy of that rare family photograph, and that's the one that you frame and put in your home, because if it's particularly old and it's in your living room where there's lots of sunlight, that is also going to cause that image to fade over time, especially if it's an older photographic format that's really light sensitive. You want to be careful about displaying it in your home for a long time. The other thing that I try to recommend or kind of encourage folks to do is, I'm sure that all of you have some of these sticky cling film 70s, 80s style family albums in your collections, where you could just put that like sticky piece of film over your photographs. those are really, really bad for your photographs over time. It can remove the emulsion from the image. They often, unstick and can get bent and torn and can tear. So if you have these in your collection, I always recommend that could be a good place to start. They make archival grade photo albums now, or you could put them in their own separate Mylar sleeves and keep them in a box. I love the look of a photo album too. But there are some archival grade options that you can consider for your photographs. I tend to look for not just archival material that says archival, but trying to look for material that also says acid free or PVC free, because a lot of our enclosures, commercial enclosures that we buy at an office supply store has has a high level of acidity, and that can also cause damage to your materials like fading, or other forms of deterioration. And we'll link to a resource link at the end of this presentation that can direct you to good archival suppliers and other more in-depth preservation tips. In relation to photographs, since that was something that people mentioned, I just want to highlight this could be a really good family activity. A lot of times at the Austin History Center, we have a lot of old family albums with beautiful Asian American families living in the early 1900s. And we know nothing about them because the date, the people, the places aren't identified. And it might seem when we take these images that information is going to be retained in our family for a long time. But if anything that the pandemic has taught me is that my memory is not so good. And so trying to capture that kind of descriptive information of your photographs is really valuable and important. And so if you have images in your family archive where that information isn't readily known already, taking a quick photo of those archives and putting it in your WhatsApp chat, like Amber mentioned with the family recipes, or maybe a text thread, or even having an in-person event where you, share the archive that you're working on and say, hey, this set of images, I don't know who's there. And you can kind of make an activity or a game, or if you're like my family, a competition will really get people talking. That can be a really good activity to learn more about what's in your collection. And there's a lot of other sort of specialized types of material in your family archive. For the length of this presentation, I don't have a lot of time to go into depth on all the different other types of material, but I do feel like textiles and clothing was mentioned in the chat, and something that I also encounter a lot, and is something that is really valuable in my own family archive. We have a lot of the textiles that my grandmother made and sold out of her home when she was living in the UK. So for quick tips for textiles is, again, storing them in cool, dark places. If you have something that's really precious or old or fragile, you can always try to either box that fabric or item of clothing. But if you're going to box and fold the article, you can create a little bit of cushion where those folds are with some like tissue paper to kind of, again, you're trying to just reduce any amount of strain where those creases or folds are happening. You can also hang them, but try to make sure the article is being hung on a pretty well-supported hanger. So there's extra cushion provided on the hanger if you're going to do that. And then you can put, a plain cloth or bag over the item to protect it from light again. And then especially with textiles, that's something that you want to inspect regularly. So, maybe 2 or 3 times a year, just checking and looking at those box materials, or going into your closet and looking at those older items of clothing and making sure that they're not being infected by pests or dust, and just trying to make sure that they're continuing to be protected. So that is all the time that I had in terms of going over specific, very basic high level preservation tips. But earlier last December, SADA hosted a family archiving workshop that was a similar structure. And that recording is available online along with a resource kit that has a lot of different resources on not only physical preservation, but oral history, planning for disaster, a lot of other kinds of tools that you can keep by your side when you're embarking on your family archiving workshop. So that is all for me. Amber, are there any other, I know we have some, upcoming events from SADA. Would you like to share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. I just would like to invite folks to a celebration that we're having next week. We're keeping it a little bit under wraps as yet, but we have a big announcement coming next Wednesday, November 17th. That's at 1:30 to 2 o'clock Eastern. It will be brief. It will be exciting. If you register now, we have a party pack that we'll send you so that you can get in on all the fun. And it's going to be a big announcement about the work that we're doing and the future of SADA and our relationship with our communities. So we'd be super excited if you would join. And then the other thing I would say that I mentioned at the beginning, of course, was just a reminder about the book that we've published. It's such a labor of love. We've all contributed many hours of our lives to making it happen, but most importantly, have been able to engage with just like incredible stories from our communities. My dad's story is in here. Aisha's got stuff in here. We've all got pieces of us in this book, and these are our stories, and we would love to be able to share them with you and learn more about yours. So thank you so much for having us. What a delight it's been to be here.
How awesome and wonderful to hear kind of your motivations for doing this really important work, and then also the technical side of it, which I don't think many of us know and pause to think about. So this has been really educational as well. So Ambar and Ayshea, so much of what you said really resonated with me. I found myself connecting to so many different aspects of your experiences. My parents also, when they came from Pakistan to the United States, like didn't really bring that many family photos with them. And I struggled to kind of put put kind of visuals to their stories because I didn't have that many photos, right? So for me, the lack of visuals was always quite jarring and it was challenging. And so I've constantly been searching for visuals as I think through personal heritage and cultural heritage. And eventually, it led me down this journey to study foreign policy and then eventually photography, which is so like disparate and random, but it's all very much shaped with kind of that experience of migration. I also loved how you both characterized kind of the relationship between the person who has a story to tell and the documenter, right? And that's something really important given that, we live in an age, an information age, a technology age where we're constantly documenting things, but the relationship between who's doing the documenting and who's the subject of it often gets ignored. And there's a power imbalance there. So I really appreciate that. And I encourage our attendees to kind of think through that a lot more, especially in the context of your family relationships. That dynamic becomes all the more critical if you want to share the right story. There are a couple of questions I had, and let's see, there's a question also in the Q&A box. Okay, this is a really good question. I'm gonna let's go to the attendees question first. I'll ask my question afterwards. Muiz Akhtar is asking, this might be a strange question, but do you all have any advice for how we could convince family members that archiving is a worthwhile activity? Not everyone may see the value of preserving things, and they may not want to visit past trauma or for other reasons. So what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I'd be interested to know if, if you are anticipating that people would not like to participate, or if you've actually received pushback already. I definitely have found that people were often less willing to participate and tell their own story, but when they heard that someone else was doing it, they'd be into it. So find the easiest person, I would say, is step one. You may not go to your eldermost relative, or the one who has the deepest or thickest or hardest story to tell, but maybe start somewhere else, and learn from people. What have they heard already? What do you know about Abbas' story? What do you know about Dadi's story? And see if you can get entree there, and then maybe go to them to correct the record. That might be one way of getting into it. But I do find that people, once they get going, they'll keep going. And so hopefully those kinds of strategies might work for you.
This also, the question also gets back to your previous points of going in with a certain assumption or expectation, and you might be surprised and come out with something completely different. So some of this also may be about the person wanting to document and tell this, and collect the story. There's that inherent tension here, right? You might find out something that you didn't expect to hear. What about the digital aspect of things? SADA as a digital archive, a lot of what you discussed, both of you discussed today, was more about how do you collect the collection of it and the preservation of it. But how might we, are there any tools or platforms that you prefer in kind of sharing the family materials and documents digitally? Do you have some favorites? I'm asking because for the foundation, in the past year, we put together a timeline project of, US-Pakistan relations, and we used a very simple online platform which creates a timeline for us, and we found it to be very user-friendly, and now it's one of the most visited pages on our website. And so we found it to just be very an easy tool into our kind of beginning to document these stories. So what do you have any favorites that you like to use, or can you direct people to?
I mean, as you mentioned, just going to whatever seems to be most accessible and user-friendly for you is going to be just a great strategy, because if you're trying to spend a lot of time, investing in something that is fancy and has a lot of different features, but can be complicated to use, and that can just distract from telling your family's history. I've recommended people using, could be as simple as a Google Drive folder with the material that you've digitized and, sharing that way. I've also had people set up free WordPress or other sort of websites with their family trees and starting to post, oral histories or other things that they've collected that way. Also, tools like Canva have photo album templates now that you can pop things in and share them as a digital zine or publication. I just always advocate that if you're starting to sort of develop a digital archive, to make sure that those records or those digitized files exist in different places. So if you're creating a timeline and that's hosting images and the history of your organization, just make sure that that's not the only place that it lives. And folks that use social media like Instagram or Facebook as their archive, and we just don't know how long that material will be hosted on there. I've had just photos I thought I had from college, but they were actually owned by someone else, and then smartly removed all of their college party photos, and now I don't have copies of those anymore. So lots of copies keep stuff safe. Try to host something on your physical desktop computer, in a drive, in the cloud, maybe. And even if it's something precious, I would even think about making an external backup on a hard drive. It's something that SADA practices as well. Do you have good platform recommendations for oral histories or things that you've encountered?
That's a good question. There's one of the resources that's shared in the link that you put up is to a new digital recording platform that's being used specifically for collecting oral histories, that gives you a space to save things. I literally have stacks of CDs around my office from all the interviews I collected doing my PhD research, and now I have no place to play them. So because I don't have a CD player anymore. So I have them backed up in many, many places. I have hard drives floating all over. My interviews are backed up in archives that are outside of my control. So my interview with my dad is at SADA. My partition interviews are archived at the University of Kentucky Libraries. One thing to know about oral histories, if you are using high quality audio, the files can actually be quite large. And so you may not want to be keeping them on your desktop computer that's getting, or my laptop anyway, that's getting smaller and smaller and the memory is getting less and less. So I really do have to have external hard drives for that. I keep them in my firebox to keep them safe from natural disasters. So they're like with my passport, keep them as safe as possible. But I do, I think depending on what your goals are, social media can be a nice place to preserve some of these materials because it gives us access to family members in multiple locations at the same time. So I have a cousin who's constantly posting old photos from his grandparents' albums, and he keeps them in a Facebook album. He still has the hard copies, but because he posts them, everyone in our family around the world gets access to them. And that's been an incredible gift. And so I wouldn't underestimate the value of social media, at least in getting your family members engaged and on board with the value, again, to go back to that earlier question, with the value of preserving these materials.
Got it. So I sort of see it as there's an archive that is physical, and one of the outputs of the archive, once you've done the work, could be something that gets shared digitally, right? Okay, interesting. Saba Farouk is asking about what to do with damaged photos. What would you recommend for fixing these?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think that if you're interested, it's a damaged photo and it still feels like it's intact enough to scan. So maybe you just see some, creasing is happening, maybe some fading, and it doesn't seem too brittle. Like you can still handle it without it, seeming like it's going to fall apart. Then you can try to digitize it. If you're really, tech savvy, there are, tutorials online that could show you how to try to Photoshop or, do some like digital preservation on your own. But I'd also recommend reaching out to, depending on where you are, finding the local archival repository, or a lot of times there's a regional network of archivists, depending on where you live. And we love to talk about this stuff and are here to help you preserve your materials. So if maybe you have material you're unsure of, if it's too fragile to handle, reaching out to an archival professional. There's usually an archivist on staff at most public library systems, if it's a big enough system. Finding a local history center. They should have resources that can help you. And if you have the financial means to send it off to a place to be, professionally, go through a professional conservator process, that's also an option too. But if you're unsure, I would advise not trying to do it yourself, because you may just end up doing more permanent damage to the photograph.
Okay. I have a question for both of you about how you kind of came on this professional trajectory, because the work that you do is so intertwined with your own stories. And so I would love to just know kind of what what were some of the personal drivers that led you down this, this path?
I'm only slightly ahead of Ayshea in the alphabet, but I'm very used to going first. So well, for me, it was really my grandmother, because I had grown up in a mixed family. But I also didn't grow up in either the US or in Pakistan. I grew up in Saudi Arabia. My father worked for Aramco. So I know lots of Indian and Pakistani-Americans from that community, but I had some space, I think, from both sides of my family, but spent a lot more time in Pakistan as a child, and never learned Urdu. So I spent a lot of time in crowded living rooms, often smoke-filled, listening to people tell stories and laugh late into the night. And I was totally disconnected from that. I couldn't follow it. I couldn't understand what was going on. And I was blessed to be able to have good relationships with my cousins. But I didn't have that kind of passive ability to absorb my family's stories. And when I got older and I learned Urdu in college, I went and lived in Pakistan as soon as I was done with university. I was doing a different research project at that time as a Fulbright scholar, and there was a dissertation, there was a woman there doing her dissertation, a woman named Lucy Chester, who now teaches at the University of Colorado, who was doing research on the Radcliffe Award, the boundary award between India and Pakistan. And I hooked her up with my uncle, who had served on the Punjab Boundary Force in 47. And I said, I'll introduce you to him and you can interview him if I can sit in. And that was the first time that I had been able to sit and listen to somebody from my family tell a story about our own history. And I was completely hooked. And everything that followed for me after that was really about gathering these partition stories. And I was lucky to be able to interview about 70 individuals in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh about their partition experiences. And my book just came out. I don't even know where it is.
Congratulations.
Thank you. My book just came out a few months ago. It's called Partition's First Generation. And so that's the culmination for me of that work that initially came out of my own commitment to learning my family's history.
Amber, we'll have to have you come back and talk about the book then. Help to order it. We've, yeah, wonderful. Congratulations. We have a lot of interest in this topic. And as you can imagine, because the generation that is able to tell these stories is, there's slowly kind of passing away. So there's a lot of interest in our community. Ayshea, what about you?
For me, I mean, I resonate with some strands of Amber's story. I'm also mixed race, South Asian American. My mom is white, my dad is Pakistani, who my father moved to the UK when he was really young before coming to the United States. And so just there's a lot of gaps and silences in my own family history that I'm still trying to uncover. But I do feel like when we were young, after my parents' divorce, my dad was really trying to be a family archivist for us, you know, really trying to encourage us to build an archive of what we were doing now. So he was constantly had his little camcorder recording us at every moment. He would surround our home growing up at my dad's house was just filled with photographs of us as we went on road trips together. I need to still contribute to the road trips project of SADA, but and when he wasn't documenting, he was telling stories. So we were sitting outside on the patio and he would, you know, just tell stories that were a mix of family memory and fiction, which he still continues to do, as well as taking us to the movies. So I encountered archives through filmmaking. That was my undergrad. That's what my undergrad degree was. And when I came to Austin, I was working in nonfiction filmmaking, but also, you know, working with young people and teaching them how to make their own films. And a lot of the children that I was working with, you know, were kind of frustrated that a lot of the canon that we teach about film history didn't really sort of resemble, you know, their own lived experiences. I was working in primarily different communities of color at the time. And so that just all kind of got me curious about, you know, when doing my nonfiction filmmaking research for documentary film, you know, being frustrated when I couldn't find the archival footage that supported the story I knew was there. And so became really curious about the politics of preservation and who are the people who get to do this kind of work. And so that really led me to graduate school. I won't downplay the role that SADA had in the type of work I do now, because I really thought that maybe archive would be the right fit for me if that meant that I had to be in a dark room only looking at, you know, upper to middle class white people and their stories. Like, I thought that maybe that was what my job would have to be. And so encountering SADA's archive and realizing that there is a whole community of South Asian Americans that find that this work is important and very much needed, and that our histories are at risk of being lost, really empowered me to kind of really focus on Asian American experiences in the United States. I feel really honored to have this, to be able to have this as my job.
Well, I'm so thankful for your journeys, which led you to, you know, to this conversation, and also to the to support the creation of an organization like SADA, which when I've been a longtime supporter of the organization. I encourage our attendees to go to the website and learn about the work, because for me, you know, I'm both of my parents are Pakistani, but my children are mixed. So my husband is white American, and he has a very rich European ancestry, and they have all these documents and photos, and you know, there's just much more formality associated with what is accessible about family history. And I love that my children have that. But because we didn't come with the same kind of archival kind of materials, and we're building this as we speak. I love the work that SADA does because my children can access it, right? So if they want to learn about what it means to be South Asian American and the journeys and the experiences, they have whatever I have available, but then they have this whole community of, you know, and its work and its documentation, which puts them in a much larger context than just their family, which is so important. And it's something that a lot of us didn't have when we were growing up. So, and this is why this book is so important, right? And so we'll have to bring you back for conversations about our stories, and we will share this obviously on the APF platform, the webinar, but any kind of related links to the conversation, we'll be sure to push out to the attendees as well. Ambar and Ayshea, thank you so much for your time and your leadership and your hard work. And I look forward to continuing the conversation and the friendship. Take care.
Thank you so much for having us. Thanks for joining,
everybody.
everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.
Take
Bye.
care.